She thought the divorce was over in one signature. But what came after quietly erased everything she believed she had won. 8:40. King County Courthouse. I had arrived early, not because it mattered, but because waiting felt worse than being present. The building was already functioning when I entered. People moved through corridors with the efficiency of repetition. Nothing about the air suggested finality, even though that was the purpose of the room I was heading toward. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Functional lighting, neutral walls, a space designed to remove emotion from outcomes. I stood near the back wall, close enough to observe everything, far enough to avoid involvement that no longer existed. The proceedings had already started before I fully registered the rhythm of it. Papers were exchanged without hesitation. A clerk reads sections in a steady cadence that flattened meaning into procedure. Property division, assets, accounts, ownership structures reduced to categories on a checklist. Everything had already been arranged before this morning. That was clear from the way no one paused. Emily Carter was seated at the table. She did not look up once. Her attention stayed on the documents, as if confirming that the version of life being finalized matched the one she had already decided on elsewhere. Her posture was still, controlled, efficient in a way that required preparation, not emotion. I watched the pages move in front of her. House in Bellevue. Investment portfolios, joint savings, vehicle assets. Each line carried weight that the room refused to acknowledge. The court recorded it as mutual agreement. The phrase was repeated once, then accepted as fact. No one asked why there were no disputes. I did not speak. I had not spoken since entering. My silence was documented indirectly, treated as absence of objection. In reality, it functioned as confirmation. It shaped the pace of everything that followed. A pen was placed into Emily's hand. She signed without visible hesitation. The motion was precise, practiced. Her signature formed the final boundary of shared ownership. Time narrowed after that, not dramatically, subtly. The room became quieter without changing volume. The clerk continued. The judge acknowledged completion in a tone that suggested routine closure rather than consequence. The case was processed rather than concluded. I observed the moment my name stopped carrying operational meaning. It happened without ceremony. One line finalized. Another closed. Nothing resisted the transition. Emily paused once after the final signature. The pen remained just above the paper for a fraction longer than necessary. That detail did not enter the official record. No one reacted to it. The pause dissolved before it could become evidence of intent. The documents were collected, stacked, reordered, prepared for archiving. I noticed the folder before it left the table. An appendix section attached to the agreement. Not emphasized, not referenced during review. It sat behind the main pages like a structural afterthought. One line existed inside it that had not been discussed aloud, not questioned, not isolated. The room treated it as standard language, but it was not standard. The clerk placed everything into the system queue. The case status shifted from active to closed without delay. No alerts triggered, no secondary review initiated. The file moved as expected through automated channels. I watched the digital confirmation appear on the terminal screen. Timestamp recorded. Archive path assigned. No flags. The courthouse returned to its normal rhythm almost immediately, as if nothing had passed through it that required attention. But I stayed still for a moment longer than necessary. Because somewhere inside the transferred packet, beyond the visible structure of the agreement, a single unexamined line had been accepted as harmless. And no one in the room had read it twice. 2 days after the filing, I had already left the house in Bellevue. The move had taken less than a day. Nothing was rearranged, nothing was contested. I took only what was already clearly mine. Personal items, encrypted drives, work files that never belonged inside a shared system. The rest remained untouched, as if ownership had already been reassigned long before paperwork confirmed it. The house stayed quiet behind me. No transitional noise. No hesitation in the structure of departure. By the second morning, financial transfers had already begun executing. Automated pathways activated without delay. Legal confirmation followed in parallel systems. Compliance verified, signatures validated, assets reassigned. The language used in the notifications was neutral, mechanical. as if value had simply changed direction, not custody. Emily Carter had full access by then. That was the official state of record. Her accounts reflected it immediately. Property titles updated in digital registries. Insurance structures reissued under her name. Investment dashboards stabilized under a single controller. Everything appeared complete. But completeness in systems like this was always a surface condition. I reviewed the settlement logs from a secure terminal that morning. The entries were clean. No disputes flagged. No anomalies visible in the primary layer. The legal architecture held exactly as designed, without friction. What was not visible was the secondary layer embedded beneath the appendix structure. It did not appear in standard exports. It did not surface in summary reports. It required direct traversal of the original file tree, a step no one had repeated after the signing. No one had returned to it. Not Emily. Not her legal team. Not even the reviewing counsel who had signed off on procedural closure. The system treated it as inert. By the third day, financial systems had already adapted to the assumption of finality. Notifications stopped referencing transition states. Accounts stabilized. Activity flattened into routine financial motion. That was when the first irregularity appeared. A minor insurance system pause, flagged internally as temporary synchronization delay. It affected one property in Bellevue. Then another linked policy followed the same pattern. No direct failure, no crash condition, only delayed propagation of updates. The timing was inconsistent with known maintenance cycles. I observed the alerts as they accumulated. Not enough to trigger escalation. Enough to form structure. Emily accessed her dashboards that evening. The logs showed her reviewing status updates across multiple assets. Everything still appeared correct at the surface level. Ownership remained intact. Values unchanged. Access uninterrupted. But one process did not complete. A single insurance update remained in pending state longer than the rest. No resolution timestamp attached. No explanatory tag. That detail was small enough to ignore. It was also the first point where the system stopped behaving as a closed loop. I traced the origin of the delay through back-end routing records. The path did not terminate at a known service endpoint. It extended into a conditional branch embedded within the settlement package itself. The same package that had been archived 2 days earlier. The archived entry still showed as inactive, but the conditional chain inside it had already started executing. Silently, sequentially, without external request. By late evening, a second system flagged a temporary restriction on property data synchronization across one of the linked insurance providers. The notice described it as routine verification hold. No action required. No explanation of why verification had been triggered at that exact point in time. Emily would not have seen the trigger event itself, only its consequence. A missing update. A delayed confirmation. A brief gap in continuity that systems usually corrected without attention. But this gap did not resolve. It expanded. Not visibly, not yet. Only in the structure beneath the reports, where dependencies began to shift without notification. I reviewed the original agreement again that night. The appendix layer remained untouched since filing, its structure unchanged, its presence still officially unacknowledged by any secondary audit process. Yet the activation marker had already moved past its first threshold, which meant the system was no longer in a passive state. It was responding, and the response had not been directed at anything visible on the surface layer of the settlement. I closed the file, but the confirmation logs continued updating in the background stream. Small entries, distributed, unremarkable in isolation. Together, they formed something else, a chain that no one had yet connected back to its origin. And at that point, I already knew the most important detail had not been missed by accident. 3 days after the initial legal escalation, the audit did not begin with attention. It began with a data anomaly flagged inside a routine compliance sweep. A mismatch in declared holdings versus verified transaction history. Small enough to be ignored in most settlements. Large enough to trigger independent review protocol in this one. I reviewed the audit initiation log at 7:42. The request had already been approved by the court's verification layer without delay. No discretionary review. No human pause. The system treated it as mandatory once conditions aligned. The independent auditor assigned to the case accessed the settlement structure within the hour. Their entry point was limited to asset verification only. That was standard. What was not standard was what the system exposed immediately after. A foreign account. Not listed in primary disclosures. Not referenced in summary schedules. Embedded through an investment layer routed via an offshore holding structure tied to a shell entity with no visible operational footprint. The account was not newly discovered. It had always been there. It had simply never been mapped against the settlement logic until the audit triggered full reconciliation mode. I watched the verification engine expand its scope automatically. That expansion was not optional. It was encoded into the agreement conditions. Any detection of undeclared financial structures by either party triggered full asset reassessment across all connected holdings. The mechanism did not require interpretation. It executed. The first consequence appeared within minutes. Emily Carter's unrestricted access status was downgraded, not revoked, not terminated, restricted. The change propagated through banking systems, property registries, and insurance networks simultaneously. A synchronized constraint layer activated across all assets tied to her post-settlement profile. The house in Bellevue entered legal hold status shortly after 9 o'clock. Ownership remained unchanged on paper. Operational control did not. Transactions linked to the property were suspended pending verification. Banking access followed the same pattern. Accounts did not close. They narrowed. Withdrawals were paused. Transfers required secondary authorization. Liquidity remained visible but unreachable. The system did not present this as punishment. It presented it as verification integrity enforcement. I traced the trigger path through the settlement architecture again. The structure was now fully active, no longer dormant or conditional. It had moved into execution state once the offshore account was validated by the auditor. That was the pivot point. Not discovery itself. Validation. Because once the system confirmed the existence of an undeclared financial structure, it no longer treated the settlement as finalized. It treated it as incomplete. Emily attempted escalation through legal channels at 11:18. The request entered the same system queue as the original audit expansion. No prioritization was granted. The process did not slow. It continued beneath her request without interruption. I observed the internal court registry update shortly after noon. Asset classification status changed from finalized division to active review. That change was not reversible under current protocol. The most significant detail surfaced in the audit trace summary generated by the court system at 13:3. The offshore account had not been manually flagged. It had been surfaced by the enforcement mechanism embedded in the original agreement, which meant it was not an external discovery. It was a self-executing condition. The mechanism had not been designed to react to fraud. It had been designed to verify completeness under hidden asset exposure conditions. And it did not distinguish intent, only existence. I reviewed the original clause structure again from the archived agreement layer. The same section that had previously appeared as secondary legal reinforcement now displayed active execution markers. The condition was simple in construction. If undisclosed assets were identified in either party's financial disclosure at the time of signing, all previously assigned assets would enter mandatory reassessment mode under court authority. No discretionary override existed. No pause function was available. The system did not wait for hearings. It did not wait for appeals. It only processed validation. By mid-afternoon, Emily's legal team attempted asset stabilization requests. Each submission was automatically routed into the same unresolved review state as the original audit. No rejection. No approval. Only suspension. The structure had already moved beyond negotiation. It was now procedural enforcement. I noted the final system update at 16:40. The court registry had formally reclassified the case, not as dispute, not as appeal, but as mandatory review initiated by contractual enforcement trigger. And once that classification was applied, the entire procedural framework locked into irreversible progression. No administrative pause was available. No external suspension allowed. The system had already decided what the next phase would be, and it was no longer waiting for permission to continue. The 72-hour lock began without announcement. I noticed it first through the access logs. Not a rejection, not an error. A gradual narrowing of permissions across financial systems tied to Emily Carter's post-settlement profile. Accounts that had been fully active the day before now responded with delayed authentication cycles. The delay was the signal. By 6:30, liquidity movement had already slowed across multiple institutions. Investment structures did not freeze outright. They entered containment mode. Transactions were queued, not executed. Capital remained visible but unreachable. The system did not describe this as restriction. It described it as stabilization pending legal recalibration. I traced the trigger origin back through the enforcement chain. The source was consistent across all nodes. Discovery of the offshore account had completed validation. That single confirmation had activated the secondary clause embedded in the settlement structure. Asset redistribution logic. Not as penalty. Not as dispute resolution. As restoration to pre-divorce baseline under incomplete disclosure conditions. The language inside the clause was precise, almost procedural. It did not reference intent. It only referenced asymmetry at the time of execution. That was enough. By midday, Emily Carter's primary banking access had entered full suspension state for 72 hours. No outgoing transfers. No portfolio adjustments. No liquidation pathways. The accounts were not closed. They were paused at system level. Investment institutions responded in parallel. Managed funds halted activity tied to her identity verification layer. Algorithmic trading exposure was automatically decoupled from her control node. The financial structure she had been actively reorganizing 2 days earlier stopped responding to her inputs entirely. I observed the timing correlation. The lock was not random. It was synchronized across systems that normally operated independently. That only happened when the enforcement layer issued a unified instruction packet. At 9:12, legal teams initiated formal review attempts. Each attempt failed to reach adjudication level. The system did not reject them. It redirected them into the same enforcement queue that was already executing redistribution logic. The clause had already moved beyond interpretation. It was active protocol. I accessed the original agreement archive again. The appendix layer remained structurally identical, but execution markers had expanded significantly. The clause tied to undisclosed financial obligations now displayed continuous processing status. That meant the system was no longer reacting to discovery. It was recalculating outcomes in real time. By the second day of the lock, ownership mappings began to shift. Not visibly at first. Internal registry adjustments. Subtle reclassification of asset control layers. The house in Bellevue changed status in the property ledger. Not fully transferred. Not fully retained. It reverted to joint control structure. A hybrid state the system only used during unresolved financial recalibration. I noted the change propagation path. It did not originate from court instruction. It originated from the enforcement engine embedded inside the agreement itself. That meant the court was not directing the process. It was witnessing it. By the third day, partial asset control began migrating into trustee administration. A temporary structure was created automatically, assigned to a neutral financial administrator selected by procedural algorithm. Its purpose was not ownership. It was containment during recalculation. Emily's control layer continued to degrade in measured steps. Each reduction followed a verification cycle. Each cycle confirmed the same condition. Incomplete disclosure at execution time triggered mandatory redistribution protocol. No exceptions were generated. No override conditions appeared. I tracked communication channels during this period. All attempts to reach the opposing party returned through automated court pathways. No direct contact logs existed. No manual responses were recorded. The system had isolated human interaction entirely. By the end of the 72-hour window, the recalculation engine had already completed 3 full cycles. Each cycle refined asset allocation logic based on validated financial exposure data. Each cycle reduced unilateral control further. The system was not deciding who owned what. It was reconstructing what ownership should have been under full disclosure conditions. The distinction mattered, because it meant the outcome was not being negotiated. It was being computed. At 18:04 on the final day of the lock, a new notification entered Emily Carter's legal dashboard. Final distribution schedule initiated. Execution window, 48 hours. No standard appeal pathway available. The notice contained no explanation beyond procedural classification. But I had already seen the underlying structure. The redistribution engine had reached terminal state convergence. All remaining variables had been resolved. What remained was execution, and once execution timing was set, the system no longer waited for permission to proceed. Seattle, Washington. Morning. The fog over Puget Sound had been low and dense, flattening the city into muted outlines. I had reviewed the execution log before 8 o'clock. The system had already queued the final court instruction for automatic enforcement. No human confirmation remained in the loop. The ruling activated without ceremony. No hearing window. No last review cycle. Only execution state. I watched the asset map rebuild itself in real time. Ownership layers shifted first in silence. Not transfers, reclassification. The system did not move property between parties. It recalculated what had never been fully separated under valid conditions. The hidden capital discovery had already been absorbed into the final computation model. That was the point where everything stabilized. The assets did not increase or decrease. They returned to structured origin ratios defined before the marriage contract had ever been executed, adjusted only by the newly validated financial exposure that had been uncovered during enforcement. The house in Bellevue changed status at 8:14, not sold, not seized. Reassigned into joint ownership with operational constraints embedded directly into title permissions. Sale functions disabled. Independent transfer blocked. Any attempt to modify structure required dual authorization through court validation. I observed the registry update propagate through municipal systems. It did not trigger alerts. It did not generate notifications. It simply replaced the previous state. Financial accounts followed in sequence. Division structures reverted to baseline allocation logic, but with correction offsets applied. Compensation was not added. It was recalibrated. The system neutralized imbalance rather than rewarding either side. That distinction removed the possibility of advantage. I tracked Michael Carter's position in the final ledger state. He had not gained beyond pre-marriage baseline. No expansion. No enrichment. The system registered this explicitly as compliance with non-exploitation parameters embedded in the agreement structure. But another annotation appeared beside his profile. Condition integrity confirmed. The clause had functioned exactly as designed. It had not attempted to secure gain. It had secured protection against undisclosed asymmetry. That was the only variable that mattered to the enforcement engine. By mid-morning, Emily Carter's control layer had fully transitioned into restricted operational mode. She remained in the house. But the house no longer responded as an exclusive asset. It responded as a shared structure with locked governance fields. Every financial interface tied to the estate now required validation beyond single-party authorization. Every attempt to modify exposure triggered system verification delays. The effect was not visible in physical space. It was embedded in access architecture. I reviewed the final recalculation summary as it compiled. 3 full redistribution cycles had been completed before convergence. Each cycle reduced volatility. Each cycle narrowed possible outcomes. Each cycle removed discretionary interpretation. What remained at the end was a single resolved structure. Not negotiated. Computed. The court system did not issue a final statement. It did not need to. At 10:47, the case status updated automatically. Closed, no appeal flag attached. No pending motion field active. No suspension pathway available. The notification arrived silently across all linked legal dashboards. The wording was identical in every system instance. Case execution completed in accordance with contractual conditions defined by both parties. I opened the archive entry that remained attached to the file. The final line had already been written by the system before I accessed it. Agreement executed in full compliance with established terms and validated conditions of mutual consent. Below it, no further commentary was recorded, no exception logs, no unresolved fields, only the timestamp of closure. I observed the archive lock-in gauge at the system level. The file transitioned into read-only historical state. Integrity sealed. Access frozen. Outside the courthouse systems, nothing changed visibly. Inside them, everything had already been decided long before the final morning arrived.